every year, this company pulls together study of sports fans. But over the last year, we've really had a challenge. How do you survey sports fans when they can't go to the game? So a lot of thought went into this, and I'll turn it over to Neil to hit some of the high points here.
Yes,
all right. I just hit the record button.
Oh, you're kidding. Mark, one job.
Good job.
Wait.
We're good to go now.
That's okay. We'll be fine.
We'll be fine.
So, first of all, I want to share, thank you to the class today for allowing us the opportunity. As Mark said, SBRnet is really a wonderful hub for data. I was working with data before data was cool, I'd like to say, although I guess that makes me sound really old. But in this case, what we're going to talk about today is sports fandom in a post-pandemic world. Everything we thought we knew about sports fans, sports fandom, their interaction with sports teams, what they bought, what they watched, what they did has changed. Everything in the past has no relationship to what's going on in the future. So we conducted our annual Sports Fandom Study, and we had to leave off one of the biggest areas of sports fandom, and that is attendance. But we made it up in other areas. We made it up by adding information on gambling on sports, which, by the way, will become one of the single biggest topics that you're going to read about, over the next few years. And in fact, there's a good chance some of you might, want to get involved, in terms of a job, because they're going to need, a lot of skilled people. And so we looked at fandom and esports, social media engagement, streaming, fantasy, and then of course gambling, like I just talked about. So what I'd like to do is, I know this is unusual, but I'd like for everyone to please take out your phones. And I don't know if you've used Poll Everywhere before, but I know in most classes they say put your phones away. Well, that's me. I want you to use your phone. So if you could set up a brand new text message to 22333 and type in the words SBRnet 2021 into the subject line, and then hit send. That will get you into the poll. And we've already got people starting to answer the first poll. And again, we want to know, this is more of a test. I promise not to share any of this information. Everything is 100% anonymous. If you could answer the question, do you enjoy this class? Just so we can get everyone into the poll, because there are more questions coming up. So far, I only see everybody loves the class. Oh, well.
It's kind of weird. We don't see the actual results on our end for whatever reason.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, me neither, Neil.
What's that?
Me neither.
Oh, interesting.
We'll just count on you to tell us what the results are.
That's interesting that you don't see them. So in this case, 100% of you said you love the class. So, Dr. Huckabee will be sending out.
Lots of A's this semester.
Okay, we got a couple of, it's okay. Got a couple of people that responded, it's okay. Any more responses before we move on to the next one? So here's the next question. What I'd like to know is if any of you have ever done any legalized gambling. And, the choices, of course, are I've been to Las Vegas, I've been to one of the tribal casinos, I've gambled on a cruise ship, or I have never done any legalized gambling. And I'm sorry we're not seeing the live results. I thought I had that set up properly. And what's interesting is that it's really, the bulk of the class is responding. 65% have said they have never done any legalized gambling. About 20% of you have been to one of the tribal casinos. And about 23% going up a little bit. And about 17% have indicated that you have been to Las Vegas. 4% on a cruise ship, not many. So legalized gambling is something that has been ingrained in our society. I realize you folks are all at a Catholic university, and you may have some different value systems than, let's say, the bulk of the population. So here's my next question. Have you ever placed a bet or a wager on a sporting event? Now, that includes if you bet with a friend. That includes if you're betting in a bracket pool right now for March Madness. That includes literally any type of wager or any type of exchange money or any type of betting on a sporting event. Mark and I, by the way, are both in our bracket pools, and I think mine's destroyed already.
Well, I was going to say I am registered in a bracket pool. I am no longer in my bracket pool. Illinois took care of that yesterday.
So about 95% of you have said that you have placed a bet or a wager on a sporting event. About 94%. So pretty much everyone. Look, everyone at some point places a bet, whether it's on it with a friend, with a family member, betting on sports, the brackets, whatever it might be. Or one of our favorites is also the Super Bowl squares, buying a square. Again, lost on that one too. So if you answered yes to the previous question, I'd like to know, which sport have you gambled on? Professional football, college football, NBA, college basketball, Major League Baseball, Major League Soccer, international soccer, golf, minor league sport, and other. Now, I wish I was able to see this live, and this is my fault. But the number one area by far has been so far college basketball. Oh, there goes football. So the number one area right now is pretty much neck and neck between professional football and college basketball. Then we've come up with NBA basketball, college football, and then another sports. What's interesting is that international soccer and golf are both tied at 5%. The reason why I wanted to show this is that what we're seeing in the data is that during the pandemic, people were really starved for the opportunity to bet on sports. So we really saw sports like Major League Soccer, golf, international soccer really pick up in terms of the sports that people gambled on. And this one's not going to help much, but when you think of gambling on sports, what is the first word that comes to your mind? I promise you, I'll let you just, throw out the first thing that comes to your mind. Right now, winning is the number one. Winning cash, number two. Losing, money. Risk, hammer. I'm not sure about that one. Dangerous. Losing, dangerous. Interesting. I wish we could see this. I will send the results around, Scott, when I send you the report. And Mark and I have said, feel free to distribute this to your class. We have no problem with that.
Sounds good.
But again, words here: risk, reward, money, losing, dangerous, things like that. So you know what? Since we can't see the results, let's get into the report itself. Mark, why don't you get us started with a little bit of the kind of our summary here?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, when we sat down to do this survey, we started working on this late last year. And really our challenge was like, how do you measure fan behavior in a year when the most obvious expression of fan behavior, going to games, that didn't exist? So I think one of the critical data sets to look at here is, population who attended or watched. And that's in the upper left-hand column. And you can see it's all pretty, thanks, Neil. I think the numbers are pretty evident. Major League Baseball down 14%. College hoops down 17%. And if you look at why that is, it's like, well, baseball, usually 162 game season, they cut it down to 60. And only a year ago, March Madness was canceled. And, I think for a lot of college basketball fans, that's their major form of engagement with college hoops. So without that tournament, attendance really suffered. And if you look at the sport that really held its head high, it's the National Football League. And why is that? NFL completed full 16-game schedule, playoffs, Super Bowl, and that's reflected in the numbers here.
One of the things I also want to point out about the numbers is that when you're working with numbers, there's really two things that you need to look at. Number one is what I like to call tonnage. And the example of tonnage is if you look in the 2018 line on the top left-hand graph, you'll notice, for instance, that 44% of people that watched games, attended games, or associated themselves with sports for the NFL was 44%. Well, if you look for Major League Soccer, it's 11%. So it's a lot more difficult to move the numbers the bigger they are. So you've got to be really careful when you're talking about numbers. And, I hear people say this all the time. This particular, game or this particular team, the fans are up, fandom's up 12%. Well, you know what? If it's Major League Soccer or even the NHL or some of the smaller sports, it's not going to be as meaningful. Now, the other thing that we want to point out also is that we saw a drop in the median age of fans. And we're going to talk about this because this relates to other spokes on that fandom hub. It relates to things like fantasy sports, esports. But as you're going to see, it's also going to relate to things like streaming. Younger people did more streaming. The interesting thing we're going to find out is that they didn't necessarily stream on their devices. Mark, do you want to hit this one?
Yeah, sure. So, like Neil said, the streaming data is interesting. What did we see over the last year? Well, we saw people who were basically, trapped in their homes. And I think the streaming data absolutely reflects that. So I think you saw more people streamed. As Neil said, it sort of brought the average age of the fan down a little bit. And, one of the things we saw, I think in the past, people viewed streaming as a behavior that was done on mobile devices. I think one of the things we saw over the last year was the use of smart TVs increasingly, and that's reflected in these numbers as well.
Yeah, if you look at 2018, 2019, 2020, I highlighted just the TV line, but in 18 to 19, 13, 14%, used smart TVs as their streaming device. I would say that's pretty much flat for MLB, 15% for NBA, college, little bit less on TV, but again, smaller numbers. Look at the jump, though, that it took in 2020. So as we were all locked in or locked down and at home more, we were using our TVs and our smart TVs as our streaming device of choice. My question, though, is will that go back to normal behavior or what was normal behavior once we're back out, going to games live, spending more time outside of our homes? Just out of curiosity, if you can do a quick hand raise, how many of you have used your smart TV to, let's say, stream a live sporting event in the last year? I have to raise my hand because I definitely have.
Can you see it all right?
Yeah, sure. So again, this has become one of the more interesting numbers or interesting changes that have occurred. And the reason why, again, to focus on this is, remember, everything we thought we knew in the past is going to change and is changing. These numbers are a wonderful tool to provide a benchmark. When you get out of school and you're sitting there and making a presentation, let's say you're lucky enough to get a job with the Detroit Tigers or the Detroit Lions in the NFL, and you're up there and you're making a presentation about streaming media to the marketing department. Well, one of the numbers you're going to have to use is you're going to have to give people benchmarks. Where do we start? Where are we going? And then where are we finishing or where are we headed? This survey will provide you with a great benchmark as to what is happening during the pandemic. And then every year we'll continue to ask the same questions and we will be able to trend that information. Mark, you want to get into fantasy? No, let me talk about fantasy a little bit.
Yes.
So fantasy sports really interesting. Out of curiosity, how many of you, and I didn't ask this to do a hand raise again, how many of you in class, and I guess you can also raise your hand online, but how many of you play fantasy sports of any kind whatsoever? It's a big number. I know Mark's a big fantasy guy. I'm not. I am not a fantasy sports player. I don't know. I'd rather be playing golf, but that's just me. But if we look at the numbers, though, from fantasy sports, we saw a decline from 2018 to 2019, pretty much across the board when it came to fantasy sports. A little bit of the kind of the bloom wore off. Everybody was real excited about, DraftKings and Mark, what's the other one? I always forget the name.
FanDuel.
Thank you. And then there've also been the creation of all these new great games, the speed games, the day games, the daily. There's all these different games. But what happened now in 2020 in the pandemic? We're all shut down. We're all in. We're all looking for things to do that relate to the things we enjoy. What happens? Well, look at that trend line. Almost across the board, we saw every one of the major sports surveyed take a positive bump. And in some cases, like college basketball, NFL, college football, not just take a bump, but an accelerated bump. The reason why I talk about an accelerated bump is that when you're, again, looking to talk about data, you want to be able to benchmark. If somebody is doing better than the benchmark, you want to be able to show that because they're doing better than the average. And that is a very important statistic. So now let's get into the talk about sports gambling a little bit. And oops, sorry about that. So this is the first year that we decided to add sports gambling to the survey. I do not have any trending data. I wish I did. But we're going to do some things coming up that will give you some really interesting numbers. So, if you look at the first chart gives you the number of fans, just overall fans betting on a specific sport in the last 12 months. As you can see, the NFL led the way with 12%, college basketball 10%. But look at Major League Soccer, who, by the way, were able to continue playing their season during the pandemic. Guess what? They were able to benefit from that. So, number of fans betting on specific games in a specific sport. We again saw those numbers in the second chart. We again looked at sports betting over the past in fantasy. So, look at the numbers, basically the jump from just regular fans to those playing fantasy. Mark, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Hey guys, can I have a quick question? Help us as we look at that data set. What's your pool of data? Where are you getting the data? Is that U.S. market? Is that international? Well, what is that?
I probably should have explained that up front. I'm sorry about that. So in Q4 of 2020, we surveyed 3,600 Americans ages 6 and older using what they call a NAT rep sample or nationally representative. So the data and the sample were balanced to the population ages 6 and older. So what we were able to do is now, look, obviously there's not going to be too many 6 to 18-year-olds represented in sports gambling. I mean, we know that. But what we were able to do is to literally build a model of the United States from a consumer point of view or a consumer perspective. So this represents just the United States, domestic in the United States. We asked, I think, a total of 24 sports. We did not highlight all 24 because we wouldn't be able to fit it all on the pages. So it's, again, nationally representative consumer sample done in Q4 of 2020.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome.
So, yeah, just to pick up on a couple things Neil was saying there, I think the two interesting charts to look at, if you look at the one on the upper left, the number of fans betting on specific sports in the last 12 months, and then you contrast that with the one that's just a little bit below it, number of fantasy players of this specific sport betting on the sport in the past 12 months. Baseball jumps from 8 to 40. NBA from 12 to 38. So you're seeing almost a 4 or 5 time multiple in certain of these cases. And again, it's something that makes sense. If you are a fantasy player, you are more interested, more skilled, more prepared to actually do betting on sports. So I think those are real interesting numbers. And again, if I was director of marketing at FanDuel or DraftKings or any one of those other big companies, and I was looking for new customers, that's the obvious place to look. One other point to make when we talk about sports gambling is just the number of states that have approved it now. Neil and I were reviewing the numbers earlier today. I think right now, gambling on sports is legal in 19 states and the District of Columbia. 6 additional states have approved it, but just haven't gone operational. And another 5 have filed the appropriate paperwork with their state legislatures and should be operational by 2021. So you add all those numbers together and you have 31 of 50 states by the end of this year will have legalized sports gambling. And Neil and I both believe that it's just a matter of time before it's legal nationwide.
Yeah, one of the things, again, as being the data kind of junkie that I am, I look for data, I look for things to make sense. Because if they make sense, they make sense. And then if they don't make sense, I want to know why. Well, in this case, look at the amount people have increased their spending in general against the fantasy players right next door to the left. You can see that because more people are gambling, and especially fantasy players, that their spending correlates to their usage. So again, we want to make sure that the data makes sense. Now, Mark hates when I put data stuff up like this, and I'm going to highlight a couple of things on, I'm going to highlight a couple of things on here. So I don't want you to look at this whole chart, so don't even try. No, don't even look at, but I want you to focus on the 3 areas that I've highlighted. Number one, there are approximately 22,182,000 people who say that they gambled on a specific sport in the past 12 months. As Mark said, there are currently 19 states that have legalized sports gambling. What do we think that number is going to get to when all 50 states have legalized sports gambling? I'm guessing it's probably going to get closer to like 40 million. It may not be an exact double because, frankly, what's going to happen is you still got a lot of people who are, going to bet illegally with, Joe down at their local pizza place, or, I guess I just stereotyped there, but oh well. That's where I
We are recording this, Neil, so it's been captured.
Yeah, there's actually a backstory there, but I'm going to leave it for another day, and it involves me. But so, what do we look at though? One of the things Mark said is that you want to, when you're standing up there and you're talking, let's say, one of you lucky enough to get an internship or a job at FanDuel or why can't I remember this, Mark?
DraftKings.
Thank you, DraftKings. One of the things you're going to ask is, we want to target some new fans. And, it's probably easy to understand that NFL fans, are a good target, and they are. But what you want to start doing is you want to look at the cross fandom against gambling, because what do we see? We see fans of the NBA also like to bet on the NFL. We see fans of college basketball, oddly enough, index at 163 for golf. What does that mean? That means that they are 63% more likely than the average fan to be betting on golf. Earlier, I talked about tonnage or people. Be careful, tonnage versus percent. But remember, indexing, and I'm sure you've all, if you're familiar with indexing is a measure of efficiency, whereas volume is a judge of people. So, for instance, if you've got 6,472 NBA fans that also like to bet on college football, but only 1.28 million college football fans that like to bet on golf, clearly you might want to go fishing where the fish are, but you don't want to forget about where the efficiencies are in terms of targeting. Higher indexing means better chance of hitting your target. It just means you won't hit as many of your potential target. The next reason why I put this up there is that because I think this provides both an interesting opportunity and a challenge. What I did was we separated this out by generation, and I'm actually going to work my way here from right to left. Mark and I are in that boomer category, as I'm sure a lot of your parents are, or even in maybe that Gen X category. So Mark and I are definitely in that boomer category. But as you can see, with only 2.9 million boomers of sports gamblers, you can see that boomers in a lot of ways are aging out. So older sports fans like Mark and I who have placed bets and do gamble, there's less of us. We're aging out. But what are we seeing? We're seeing the Gen X or the 40 to 55-year-olds, again, probably some of your parents, aging in a little bit more. We're noticing that they are starting to, understand gambling, play gambling. But look at where the big numbers are. Millennials, 24 to 39-year-olds are the dominant generation when it comes to gambling on sports. Why? They've been probably using their devices the longest. They've been probably exposed to gambling on sports the longest using their devices. And they offer a fairly target-rich environment in terms of size. But here comes the challenge. The challenge is the Gen Zs. They are literally the smallest generation in terms of volume. Now, they're also the youngest, of course, 13 to 23. So in theory, probably only the 18 to 23-year-olds are able to gamble on sports. So again, but it presents an opportunity that I think is interesting because is it one of availability or is it a problem with education? Do younger consumers know the types of bets, know how they should be gambling, know the types of things? That's where I believe the opportunity lies. I believe that younger consumers don't understand sports gambling the way their older millennial brothers and sisters do, and possibly the way that their Gen X parents or even their Gen X or baby boomer older parents and grandparents do. So again, if you're working with DraftKings, you're working with one of the fantasy, and by the way, Mark and I recently have been contacted by a number of other companies that are going to be jumping into this category. There's going to be jobs. They're going to need data. They're going to need people that understand data. They're going to need people that understand how to tell a story with data. So again, this type of data gives you a great opportunity to be able to understand the data and then understand the stories behind the data. I also, by the way, highlighted Gen Zs in terms of, the different sports that they've gambled on. And again, as you can see, remember we talked about indexing early? Look at the indexing on Gen Zs that have gambled on NHL hockey. While it's about 108,000 people, so it's not a big number, it indexes very low, which means not only is it a small target, but low likelihood of you hitting the target. So again, you want to always be able to balance the numbers, raw number, as well as the index. Mark, do you want to get into social media a little bit?
Yes, sure. Absolutely. So, Professor Huckabee, was there a question there I heard, or no? Keep going.
Keep going. I think we're good.
Yeah, and we'll answer questions at the end. We'll answer questions about any of this, or if you guys just want to talk about the sports business in general, we're happy to offer our perspective on it.
You bet.
So, in terms of social media engagement, I think it's interesting to see again what's taken place over the last year or so. So you had, if you look at these charts, all the social media platforms, with the exception of YouTube, benefited from sports fans being on lockdown for the past year. Twitter and Instagram, clearly the big winners, and kind of showing a bounce back from where things were in 2018. So, Neil, what conclusions do you draw from this?
Remember I said to focusing on trends or focusing on the past right now is very dangerous. Well, in this case, no better situation or no better example is what we're seeing right here when it comes to sports fan social media engagement. After a 2-year decline in social media usage, now some of that has gotten picked up on some of the newer applications like TikTok, like Snapchat, but we saw for 2 years, a decline. NBA kind of flat. NBA declining in Twitter, Major League Baseball kind of flat, college basketball on a decline slightly, NFL slight decline, college football on a decline, NHL, Major League Soccer. But look what happens in 2020, the orange line. All of a sudden, everybody bounces back during the pandemic. So what's going to be important is those being able to take a look at, obviously you want to take a look at what was, but you want to take a look at what is now and then really pay attention to these new benchmarks. Because will Twitter be able to hold on to these particular fans? Why is this important? Because remember, people are advertising with Twitter. And if you're looking to go after gamblers, you're looking to go after, fantasy sports players, esports fans, you want to be able to make sure that you're selecting the digital network or the social media property that will best suit the target that you're going after. Don't just throw money out there on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or even YouTube. Target your dollars, again, to where you're most likely to hit the fans that you're desiring to attract. Now, this pretty much is a kind of a repeat, but what this does is that this talks a little bit about people that are engaged with teams and players and coaches and even bloggers. And again, when we talk about social media, what we'd like to talk about is engagement. And engagement, of course, means activity. And we can see that from 2018 to 2019, almost across the board, we saw a decline or some sports kind of flat. Now, look, if a sport is up 1%, down 1%, you know what? For the most part, you can call it flat. But if you're running from, let's look at NBA, in 2018, your engagement with players, coaches, teams, leagues, writers, broadcasters went from 36% down to 33%. Well, that's a drop of almost 10%. Actually, it's a little more than 10%. Not as good with doing math in my head as I used to be. Used to be good at it. But what happened? What a bounce back. It went from 33% to 50%. So again, understanding exactly what's going on within the individual digital social media channels, but then understand how people are engaging within those channels. This, by the way, would be considered a subset of the previous chart. So you could actually probably do a little bit of a analysis to say, look, 40% of football fans, are engaged with Twitter, and another 46% are 27% are engaged with players. So you could do again, create a story there. Look at rankings, look at volume, look at the indexing. And then, of course, we talked about, esports. Now, this has been an interesting situation. Mark and I, as we said, between us, we have over 40 years of experience in the sports business. And, there are some of our peers who thought that esports was going to be kind of the death of traditional sports in a lot of ways, or that's what they're projecting. And in some ways, what we're seeing is we are seeing people here comes the leaf blower guy. It never fails. So what we're seeing is that the number across that left-hand side is people who watch traditional sports across the 3 years. We looked at more often, and what do we see? We see a 3-year decline. About the same, stayed flat. Less often, again, we saw a 3-year, actually we saw a pretty much flat from 18 to 19, but we saw a big increase in 2020. So there's no question that esports is having an effect on traditional sports. But which sports is it having the biggest effect on? Where are the sports games as they relate, let's say, to individual sports? And you have the ability to be able to evaluate, individual type games, first-person shooter games like Fortnite, Halo, Overwatch, versus the sports games like FIFA, soccer, Madden, NBA 2K. So again, you can really get into what are those esports that are, one, taking fans away, and then, of course, how to reach them. Again, remember, in 2020, we did not ask about people who attended sports because, frankly, there was no people who attended sports. And we felt the data was just going to be terribly skewed in the wrong direction. And again, I pointed out right here is that when you look at the numbers of number of fans who participated, attended, and watched esports in the last 12 months from the different traditional sports, the NBA numbers typically skew a little younger. Well, they participated, attended, or watched esports in the last 12 months. MLS, again, tends to skew a little younger. Again, we saw an increase. So again, sometimes stories work, sometimes they don't. So it's really good to be able to kind of, find the stories that work. Just to back up, again, the data was all based on a survey of 3,500 people. It was done in Q4 of 2020. We do call it our 2021 study. These are all the different sports that were included. There's a much larger report that is available on the SB. Oh, by the way, all of the data that we showed here will be available on the SBRnet site, of which you are subscribers to. So you literally only need to go to your library portal or your library site, and the SBRnet data is available. So if you're involved in doing any type of projects, if Professor Scott assigns you a project about sports sponsorship or about other issues related to sports, and you need to get some data, the place to start is on SBRnet. So if there's any questions, Mark and I are happy to, or if you just want to talk in general, doesn't have to be related to the things we even talked about here today. So any questions?
All right, guys, any questions for Neil and Mark as we kind of, there's a lot of information to kind of assimilate there, isn't it?
There is.
So my question would be, as you look at numbers, how do you, like you said, you're kind of creating a story based on the numbers. How do you know what you create as a story is right?
Well, that's an interesting question. The first thing I think, you want to do is you want to ensure two things. Number one is that all research, and I mean all research, includes certain assumptions that have to be made. You must make those assertions or assumptions known up front. You're going to make certain assumptions, must be done. But the second thing is that you've got to let the data tell the story. I always like to encourage those in the business, whether you're at a high level working for, Adidas, Nike, Skechers, people like that, or students coming out of college. Don't try to push the data around. Let the data fall where it may or fall where it should, and then build your story around that. But do we know every story is going to be accurate? Hell no. I can tell you some very specific examples where I stood in front of a large group of people. In fact, I stood in front of a large group of people at Under Armour a number of years ago and made a presentation. And I said one thing, and I may have said 5 things right, but I said one thing that it turned out to be wrong in my projection or my prediction. And guess what I heard about? I heard about the one wrong thing. Didn't hear much about the 5 things I got right, but I heard about,
Well, I think that's an important point. And, to the students who will be out in the workplace in a number of years, I mean, oftentimes you'll be asked to build a case, right? Hey, we need marketing dollars to support the new Gatorade launch. And you'll be tasked with pulling together numbers that support, what your boss wants done or what your department head wants done. And then you'll need to almost go in and sort of cherry pick data that supports the point of view, and it may sort of fly against, the big picture a little bit. So, and oftentimes you can see when you see surveys on TV, typically political surveys are notorious for this, where they will ask the questions in a certain way that will slant the answers to deliver the desired results. So I think it's important. One thing Neil always talks about, and he's 100% right, when you're analyzing data, analyze it from a couple different sources, and that way that's going to present you a much more accurate picture.
Good. Well, you guys, any questions?
Come on, nobody has any questions about esports or fantasy sports? I remember when I asked how many people out there play fantasy sports. How many of you were new to playing fantasy sports this year during the pandemic? Anybody want to volunteer a hand on that one? I see somebody kind of in the back. Tell us about just out of curiosity, your experience in playing fantasy sports this year. Did you do it because you just had more time because you were locked down? Give us a little bit of your fantasy sports history or story.
I just got kind of drawn into it by a group of friends that I'm doing it. And I was just kind of open to it more because I didn't know much about it, and I didn't have much money involved. It was kind of a low risk for that, but it just kind of became more interesting, and it was hard for me because I didn't know much about it, and how it all worked and all that. So it's starting out it was a little different, but learning to go with it and stuff with some experience stuff now, it's getting more fun.
Were you able to hear that, guys?
I was.
Yeah.
Peer pressure, of course, is a big factor for things like fantasy sports, and in fact, will also become, I think, a factor when it comes to gambling on sports. I think that you'll hear that your friends are gambling a little bit. Some of them are going to say they're making money. By the way, nobody ever tells you how much money they lost. They only tell you how much money they won. So I would be very careful. Any of the women that are either in the class or in the classroom physically or online, are any of you women playing fantasy sports out of curiosity?
We've got a couple that do, yeah.
So one of you women out there, can you share your experience a little bit? Why did you start playing fantasy sports? Was it some of your friends were doing it? Was it a peer pressure thing? I'm curious.
What do you think, McKenna?
I started playing it because I was a family league.
Did you hear that?
No, that one I didn't hear.
So it was a family league, something that their family was doing together. So
that's interesting. Would you, McKenna, that was your name?
Yes.
McKenna, would you, let's say a group of classmates decided to, do a fantasy league for, I'm not going to make any cliches or things like that, but let's say you did they did a fantasy league for professional sports, for let's say college football. Would you participate, or would you only do it, because it stays in the family, so you feel it's a little bit more, contained and a little bit more controlled?
I would definitely participate.
Scott, I didn't hear that.
yeah, she said she definitely would participate with classmates as well.
Yeah. Well, Neil, I think that's an interesting point, and that might be something to explore down the road is, what provides sort of a comfort level. I know in my family, we all play in the same fantasy league together. And I think that as sort of a point of entry, I think that provides a comfort level for everybody, particularly my daughter.
Yeah, the interesting thing is I am a big sports fan also, but I am not a big fantasy player. I've played a few times and I find myself personally losing interest in it. Now, I know I guess Scott, we're coming up on the end of this, on the end of the class, correct?
We are, yep.
One last question.
Or go ahead.
One last question. How many of you guys how many of you are playing esports right now? I mean, actively playing esports? Any of the, like,
Sports?
I mean, not right this second, obviously, but how many of you, play with your friends? I would assume it's most of you.
Yeah, I would say probably 2/3 of the physical class. It's hard for me to obviously see
Okay.
but yeah, 2/3, I bet.
For one of you,
They're liars. No, I'm just kidding.
Are you playing less real sports because of your participation in esports? In other words, are you spending more time in front of the screen and less time out, let's say on a basketball court, or less time running or whatever? I mean, anybody want to volunteer? I see somebody nodding in the front, by the way.
Yeah, we also, I think, have a question. I see Chandler. Chandler has raised.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think he's probably indicating he plays esport too, but most of the students are shaking their heads no. It hasn't necessarily impacted their live sport engagement as athletes or whatever. And we have a high incidence of athletes on our campus, but it just means it's chunking into their other discretionary time, or perhaps their time they should be studying, right?
Well, look, there's a lot of schools of thought on this esports situation. Look, I believe that, both from a participation standpoint, a fandom standpoint, I do believe they all have to kind of work together. I think learning how to put those pieces together, I think, will be incumbent upon students like yourselves. Look, I know this is goofy, but you're the future of the industry. You're going to be the one standing up there in front of, sponsors. You're going to be the one standing up there in front of, whether it's going to be, if you're working, let's say, on sponsorships for the Michigan Wolverines, the Detroit Tigers, the New York Mets, whomever it might be, you're going to be the ones that are going to be directing all of these changes and utilizing this data to help these companies make decisions. Because frankly, there's going to be a lot of decisions that are going to need to be made in the next 24 months as sports comes back online, as people start to come back in stadiums, as people start to feel more comfortable. All of these things will get increased activity, and there will be more jobs out there. I guarantee it. So, if this you feel is an area that you want to go into from a professional standpoint, there is going to be definitely some jobs, and your understanding of data, how to use it, how to tell a story with it, is really going to be what's going to separate you from others that are looking for those same jobs. Mark, Scott, are there any more questions? Or
I think we're good. I mean, we do have one quick one, and we've got about 2 minutes. So
okay.
If you can, so Joel, nice and loud.
Yeah. Why has sports betting been legalized and I guess grown more in the last 5 years or so than previously?
Oh, let me take a swat at that one, Neil. I think it's money. I think the states see it as a real revenue stream, and I think the states will continue, particularly after the pandemic, when a lot of states have had their treasuries beat up. I think this is an easy place for them to go for money.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mark's 100% correct. I do believe that a number of states feel that what they've learned from legalization of cannabis in those states, they've been able to generate significant tax revenue, and I feel that they look at this as an incremental source of revenue, and frankly, a lot of colleges and pro teams are going to be looking at this as an incremental source of revenue. There is going to be an ethical and moral challenge, though, that they're going to have to deal with. But I do believe that You know, just like everything else, guys, all comes down to the money.
Yeah, and I mean, in Michigan right now, if you're streaming anything or just advertisements, if you listen to 10 advertisements, I bet you 8 of the 10 right now are either cannabis or gambling, sports bets at this point. It's pretty crazy. And the part that for me is really interesting is ultimately, will these lines in games and the gambling, is that gonna, like, are coaches gonna know that information? And I just wonder how much impact that might potentially have on games and how coaches coach and so forth. It's just, I mean, we won't know immediately, but over time, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
I do
last
think
point on that one. And Scott, you and I talked about this last week. I think it's going to be real interesting to see, all right, this money's going to be flowing into state coffers from sports gambling. How do they spend it? Look in Colorado, where they've set aside a certain amount of that money that has to go into sports and recreation facilities, and they have a ton of money, more money than they can spend on bike and hiking trails. In Norway, we remember a couple of years ago when Norway was sort of the darling of the Winter Olympics. They came from nowhere to rise up and compete with Russia and the United States in terms of medals. Part of the reason is because a certain amount of the money that goes to comes from sports gambling in Norway goes into an Olympic development fund. So I think, you know, another story to look at is how is this money spent by different states and governments, and that's going to be a source of creating jobs as well.
it does. I think it's also going to present an ethical challenge, and I mean that's a class for a whole other day.
Very good. Hey guys, I really want to just give you a huge thank you for taking your time to spend with us this morning. Really interesting information and just a good, hey, this is what the future looks like. And for some budding sports industry students, this is really good for us to hear. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Happy to help.
Mark and I want to thank Professor Scott for giving us this opportunity. And again, if you get involved in doing any projects, just send Mark or I an email, and we're happy to help you out if you need it. Thank you.
Very good.
All right, thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, guys.
Bye-bye.